Philip Brunegraber here again with the second rule from Dr. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos, as I continue to go through these his book and use it to try to educate my students and anyone else who might be interested. In this time of absolute chaos, and Dr. Peterson does a great job of mentioning that there's a balance in life. Eastern philosophies called it yin and yang. In the Hebrew Christian world, it was often called good versus evil. But almost any philosophy or way of thinking noticed that there are two sides of our existence: one that tends to be good for us, and one that tends to be bad for us, and that could be looked at as chaos. And clearly, right now, we're experiencing some chaos. And ironically, not ironically, right? Naturally, Dr. Peterson mentioned that historically, throughout human time, nature was considered chaos. The natural world was unpredictable. Things happened, weather patterns changed, things would happen, natural disasters would happen. And in this case, a virus, a pandemic, is wreaking havoc on our world. So we're in a time of chaos, and many of us are looking for order. So I thought this was a great time to use his work, 12 Rules for Life, to help educate my students and others. So rule number 2, we did rule number 1 was stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Now that seems simple. Of course, we should treat ourselves well, but we actually don't typically treat ourselves very well. Dr. Peterson talked about how oftentimes prescribed medicines are not completed or sometimes even filled. A prescription is given by a doctor to someone to say, hey, this medicine will help you. And oftentimes the person prescribed that medicine never even gets the prescription filled. And if they do get it filled, they oftentimes don't take the entire prescription. It was made very clear to me recently when I busted my toe and I had an infection in my body. My doctor prescribed the medicine. He said, you must finish all of this. Now, me being a person who's finally taking care of myself like someone worthy of helping, I finished all my medicine. And sure enough, the infection's gone and I'm healthy again. But we aren't often very good at caring for ourselves. Oftentimes, we're better at caring for other people. We will make sure, hey, don't do that, don't eat this, don't go there, don't do these things, right? And yet, we're not even taking our own advice. We're not treating ourselves as someone we're responsible for helping. And Dr. Peterson gets into this a little bit deeper. He talks about, I will quote him. He says in his book, quote, chaos is the domain of ignorance. I think there's a lot of truth in that. We are very afraid of things we do not understand, and that tends to create chaos. We saw it in this COVID-19 response a little bit as people were, as it sort of hit the United States. Fear out of mostly ignorance sparked some running on the grocery stores, some even violence against other people, because people were terrified of what is going on, mostly out of ignorance, and it was creating a lot of chaos in our civilized world. On the flip side of that, Dr. Peterson says, quote, order, by contrast, is explored territory. So if we had experience with something like this in the past, we might have had more of a sense of like, it's no big deal, we've been here before, we can get through it. I know in my own world, my first sort of failed relationship, I'd always had sort of difficult relationships, and it weighed on me quite a bit. And then when I finally figured out how to maintain healthy boundaries, what I wanted and what I deserved, and then held people accountable to that in my partnerships, it wasn't terrifying anymore. And you'll find that true. I work with teenagers, obviously. Some of you are watching this, and I get it. You feel as though those first relationships that fail is the end of the world. How could you ever recover from something like this? But you'll find that honestly, most relationships fail, right? There will be only a handful of romantic relationships in your life that will be really successful and then last throughout your life. So most of them will fail. And when you recognize, hey, I've been here before, I've had my heart broken before, I can forge ahead, I can get through this, it's not as bad anymore, right? Order, by contrast, is explored territory in Dr. Peterson's words, right? And so that's what we're experiencing now. We, in our world at the moment, COVID-19, we haven't had anything like this in a long time. The last pandemic, as everybody's probably mentioned, was the Spanish flu 1918 and into the early 1920s. And it's been about 100 years then since we've seen anything like this. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we were cruising pretty well. Nothing was really threatening our world. We had tons of luxuries to keep us comfortable, and we were not in any way, shape, or form really ready to deal with sort of catastrophe on this level. And so it's creating a lot of chaos. And we even saw a lot of chaos coming from the media. They had no way of knowing either. Maybe they had some other motivations, but we had a lot of people in media giving a lot of kind of false information. And our politicians, our leaders also spreading kind of some false, giving some false information or some chaotic messages out there that weren't really helpful. Obviously, as we begin to sort of deal with this, and it'll peak hopefully soon, and we begin to get on the backside of this, everybody should gain a little more confidence because there's some explored territory, right? We've been sitting around dealing with it for a little bit, and it isn't quite as chaotic any longer. Dr. Peterson gets into some other things. He talks also about how there's a lot of self-loathing and loathing for mankind that gets in our way of caring for ourselves like someone we're responsible for helping. We do this quite a bit. I see it in my classrooms a lot. A bunch of my students will say things like, well, I'm just not good at this, or I'm just not good at school, or I'm a terrible test taker, or whatever, right? Now, some of those things may have some basis in reality, but that doesn't mean you should loathe yourself and just give up. You know what? It's good for you to continue to learn. It's good for you to continue to push yourself. And it's great for you, as our first rule had, to have confidence in yourself. We also begin to have this self-loathing or this loathing of all mankind, right? It's easy to do. We can look at some of the things going on in the world and we can see, holy smokes, there are some horrible people out there. And that's certainly true. All you have to do, and many of you are probably watching the same documentaries on Netflix that I am, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, there is pure evil out there in the world. And indeed, that is true. There are some very evil, sadistic, terrible people in the world. I'm a history teacher. If you've been in my class, in my history class, you've learned all about it. My American Justice class, right? We've talked about plenty of things that are horrible. That said, there's plenty of people who are also very good and selfless and helping other people, and that can really contribute quite a bit to our world. So try to keep in mind that there's a balance there. While we do have this side of us, again, back to the yin and yang, or the good versus evil, black versus white, those aren't absolute things. And we have sort of a dual nature in us, and so does all of mankind in general. So there's no need to get that stuck in that self-loathing place where you're just hating on yourself constantly and you're telling yourself, well, I'm not good enough anyways to be treated well, so I'm not going to take care of myself. No, you need to embrace that you are worthy of being cared for and worthy of being loved, and that you should treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. If you were helping you, what would you do? If you weren't you, if you had someone who was exactly like you and you were in charge of helping them, what would you do? You'd make them take their medicine. You'd encourage them to eat better. You'd encourage them to get some rest. You'd encourage them to be confident and feel good about themselves and believe in themselves. You'd encourage them to exercise. You'd encourage them to do their homework and to do some learning and to do some reading and things like that. So try to get in that mindset of getting outside yourself a little bit and looking at you and trying to think of what is best for you. What do you actually need? And then be the person responsible for you. Take responsibility for yourself. It's one of the biggest issues I come across in my classroom is people not taking responsibility for themselves or being accountable. Now, I'm talking about teenagers, and that's somewhat typical for that developmental stage, but you see it in the adult world, in the broader world as well. People not being responsible and taking account for their own decisions. So take control of that. Look at yourself as someone you're responsible for helping, and then treat yourself in that way. And if you can do those things, you will absolutely find yourself growing and being a better person. What principles do you hold that are important to you? Embrace those principles. Hold yourself accountable to those things, and treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. All right, that was rule number 2, and I am Philip Brunegraver. Thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy.